History can tell us a lot in what might change in an election, and a lot of it goes against what the polling suggests. I've gone through all the election results since 1945 and looked at the vote share and seat numbers to determine the question, are we automatically going to get a Labour victory? So, from my own personal research, I'm trying to find out if there's a link between inflation, GDP, net migration, and the status of the NHS in the past, and how that has determined the electoral result. You may recognise my voice. There's a version of this video from 2017 and 2019, and now here I am in 2024, studying the elections again. There were a few complaints from my last video about its relevance to the title, so for this video I intend to talk solely about events relevant to the 2024 election, and I'll look at polling and how that relates to people's views on particular subjects that may have won or lost elections in the past, and compare it to today. So, 1945. World War II had just ended. Clement Attlee was a Labour Prime Minister after winning an election from Winston Churchill being caretaker Prime Minister during the Second World War. They were fearful that a Tory government could lead to high unemployment that happened during the 1930s. The Tories had 196, the Liberals had 12, and the Liberal Nationals had 11 seats. So Labour held on to urban areas like Newcastle, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Sheffield, Birmingham, and Wales. The Clement Attlee win in the 1945 election is proof that the Conservatives weren't always seen as a steady hand on the economy. It tells us that, in fact, national debt was at a whopping 211%. Just because debt was high, it didn't stop nationalisation and high taxation policies from Clement Attlee, something which both parties are fearful of today, but was extremely transformative then. The UK population at the time was 38 million. That compares to 67 million today. Of people today, a whopping 68% of people say NHS services are bad, compared to 23% of people who think they're good. 41% of people think that Labour is better at handling the NHS compared to 10% for the Conservatives. Just 2% want the NHS privatised completely. 31% wants it nationalised completely, and 57% want partial privatisation. This shows the tightrope parties have to balance between. They have to somehow find a way to improve the NHS with mostly national money, low prices, and a high population. Labour fare better, but the picture also ties into the economy and net migration, where Labour have reputational damage. 1947. By 1947, Britain's coal industry was nationalised and India gained independence from Britain. By 1948 was the start of the Windrush generation, and of course the NHS was actually established. By 1950, now, during this election, the Conservatives had to swallow some pride and accept that the NHS was a good idea, so they focused their campaign on what if the Labour Party nationalised even more and reduced any capitalist competition into services. Of course, competition helps investment. The Labour Party and Clement Attlee won, but only by a majority of 5 seats. The U-turn is demonised today, but it worked for Churchill then, and it explains why our politics is so immobilised today. 67% of people support nationalising energy companies. 69% of people want to see trains run by the public sector. 69% of people also believe water companies should be nationalised. And 65% of people think dental checkups should be free for everybody. The question is, will the parties of today be willing to risk economic questions should they promise these? I doubt it, given Labour's last defeat, in which they promised a lot of nationalisation things on their manifesto. It also shows how unpopular Conservative ideology is for privatisation at the moment. So, 20 months later, we have another election. The Conservative manifesto read Britain strong and free and stressed that safeguarding our traditional way of life was integral to the Conservative purpose. They did not propose to dismantle the welfare state or the National Health Service. The Conservatives won 321 seats to 295. The Labour slogan 2024 talks about change. But change can be scary to some if social changes become too great. I'll expect the nationalist spirit of the Euros to play a large part in this election. 45% of people see themselves as nationalistic. That compares to 46% of people who don't, so it won't necessarily be a vote winner. In 2022, 16% of people consider themselves to be woke, 41% do not, and 31% don't know what it means. 80% of people think it's important to be aware of issues of race and social inequality, but 43% of people think someone who was born biologically a man should not be identified as a woman if they hadn't had gender reassignment surgery. That compares to 25% who think they should. This explains the "what is a woman" conservative attack line we've seen at Prime Minister's questions. But given the transgender community is a minority, it won't necessarily be a vote winner. By 1952, King George VI died, and by 1953, Queen Elizabeth II officially became coronated as the Queen. So, Winston Churchill's health worsens and he resigns as Prime Minister. So Anthony Eden becomes Prime Minister and a general election is held by May of that year. And not much changes. The Tories of 2024 are hoping the positive spirit and optimism of this election will be reflected in 2024 by the European football tournament. 49% of people this week feel happy, 41% feel sad, 32% feel frustrated, and 23% feel stressed. 1956. So the invention of the car as well as industrial fumes meant that London was full of smog, so the Tories created the Clean Air Act, and Windscale Nuclear Power Plant Station opens. Also in 56, Israel, the UK, and France invaded Egypt to regain control of the Suez Canal, the canal which was under control by the Egyptian leader at the time. The canal lets boats go from behind Africa to Europe without going all the way around Africa. Britain could get oil and access to the remains of its empire through the canal. So the plan was to give information to Israel about Egypt signing arms deals with the Soviets, therefore persuading Israel to strike Egypt, and then Britain and France could invade and act as peacemakers. They managed to get control of the canal, but the canal itself was useless. It also upset President Eisenhower in America because the Soviets used the attack to invade Hungary, and Eisenhower was going through an election campaign at the time, so he threatened serious damage to the British financial system by selling the US government's pound sterling bonds. The failure of the British government led to Sir Anthony Eden resigning and Harold Macmillan becoming Prime Minister. By 1958, the motorway system opened. 1959. So Harold Macmillan won the 59 election despite Anthony Eden being so poor beforehand. Macmillan summed up the national mood, saying that people have never had it so good. So just like Johnson, Macmillan was popular the first week with a 5% lead, but this narrowed as time went on. The Labour Party slogan, "Britain belongs to you," highlighted the Conservative-led disparity between rich and poor. Hugh Gatehill made a mistake in declaring that a Labour government would not raise taxes if it came to power, even though the Labour manifesto contained pledges to increase spending, especially to increase pensions. So the Tories had 365 seats, an increase of 20, and Labour had 258. 47% of those surveyed think that state pensions will not be enough to provide a good standard of living upon retirement. The Conservatives changed Prime Minister unelected, and it still helped them win the election. I'm not sure the public can stomach the 3 changes we've had since the last election, but it might not be the political weapon Labour thinks it is today. By 1963, Harold Macmillan resigned the government whip, but not the Conservative one, in protest at the lifting of sanctions on Italy after the invading of conquering Absysia, known as Ethiopia today. Sir Alec Douglas Home becomes Conservative Prime Minister. In those days, the Tories were unpopular because John Pafermo, the Secretary of State for War, was found to be having an affair with model Christine Keeler. The result was a very small Labour majority of just 4 seats, with 317 against, 304 for the Tories, with the Tories losing 61 seats. One thing you can say about this election, as opposed to the 2019 election, is that neither Keir Starmer nor Rishi Sunak are large personalities. This counts for them in the sense that you don't have a jock clown with previous girlfriends like Boris Johnson, or a nerd with tweed jackets and an allotment like Jeremy Corbyn, because they can be targeted with sleaze headlines and be personified by the media like a soap opera caricature of themselves. However, when you're trying to be clean, Mr. Perfect, you open yourself up to when you're not so perfect or seem disingenuous and untrustworthy. For example, Keir Starmer was once the Brexit second referendum Corbyn supporting guy, now he's the centre-left Brexit supporting guy. Rishi Sunak said he'd lead with integrity, but there's been lots of lies, U-turns, scandals during his tenure as PM. In fact, 59% see Rishi Sunak as untrustworthy according to YouGov polls. That compares to 51% for Boris Johnson on the 30th of December 2019. 47% see Keir Starmer as untrustworthy. That compares to 60% for Jeremy Corbyn in 2019. The death penalty was abolished and comprehensive education was initiated. By 1966, Labour even lost a by-election, having a majority of just 2. Douglas Home was replaced by Edward Heath. Opinion polls in early March gave the government an 11-point lead over the Conservatives. Labour ran its campaign with the slogan, "You know Labour government works," and a national transport plan was envisaged to integrate road and rail transport investment, and an ambitious house building programme was unveiled. Even a touch of socialism managed to peep out the manifesto under the guise of renationalising the steel industry. The Conservatives, who dubbed themselves the Party of Peacemakers, had 131 action points in their manifesto. Actions, not words. These included the old staples of low inflation, curbing the power of the trade unions, and reform of the welfare state. The Conservatives were, on the whole, unsettled throughout the campaign, which ran flawlessly for Labour. They struggled hard to come to grips with the twin problems of fighting the election as the opposition under the direction of a new and untried leader. During the campaign's early stages, Heath ruffled Labour's feathers by raising the possibility of Britain joining the common market. Foreign Secretary Michael Stewart said the government would not enter the common market until after its agricultural policy had changed. Callaghan said Britain was willing to join but needed to negotiate. The two-party leaders then traded blows over the subject, with Wilson accusing Heath of rolling on his back like a spaniel at any kind of gesture from the French. Labour gained 48 seats, taking them up to 363. The Conservatives lost 51 seats, leaving them with 253. So Labour had only been in power 2 years by this point. The economy wasn't great, but they were promising a lot. This shows that 2 years is too soon for voter fatigue. But it also shows a poor economy in a short time period at least doesn't automatically count against a government. What will count against a party in an election campaign is infighting. The public believe the Labour Party is equally divided and united. 31% say united, while 34% say divided. Whereas a whopping 73% of people say that the Conservatives are divided, compared to 6% who say united. That proves that the public think the Labour Party is a more united front than perhaps media stories might have you believe. 1968. Abortion and homosexuality were legalised in Great Britain. 1970. So Labour's lead in the polls was looking shaky. Poor economic figures were making the Conservatives seem like the better party. So the Conservatives won 330 seats to Labour's 287. What we tell from this is the public's patience for a poor economy is thin. If the next government don't turn around the economy, then I won't expect them to stay in government for very long. Or if they are, I'd expect them to change Prime Minister. By 1971, North Sea oil concessions were auctioned, and by 1973, Britain joined the European Economic Community. So, the coal miners of Great Britain went on strike after wage negotiations between the National Union of Mine Workers and the National Coal Board collapsed. A state of emergency was declared and a 3-day week introduced to save electricity. The failure of Edward Heath's Conservative government to resolve the industrial disputes that blighted Britain's economy forced him to go to the country. Heath went to the country to gain a mandate to a deal with both the unions and the energy crisis. His strategy was based on the belief that voters were fed up to the teeth with the miners and favoured steps to take them in hand. The February election ended in a hung parliament. The two main parties both saw their share of the vote decline, and the balance of power now rested with the Liberals. Heath entered into negotiation with the Liberal leader, Jeremy Thorpe, for a coalition government. Thorpe was keen, but a coalition with the Tories threatened to split his party. He eventually declined. So, on the 4th of March 1974, Harold Wilson entered 10 Downing Street as a Labour Prime Minister for the third time. This is evidence that when a situation causes economic unrest, or when the economic unrest is caused by the situation, half the voters will blame the situation and half will blame the government and vote against. So I'd expect Rishi Sunak to be saying things like, vote for me and we'll get the Rwanda plan done, drastically cut net migration and save pressure on public services. But Keir Starmer will be saying, no, vote for me because those guys caused the economic mess to begin with. If enough fear of what might happen if the Rwanda plan is not invoked is presented, it could lead to a hung parliament. However, 35% of the public think it's unlikely that migrants will ever be deported to Rwanda. So, it's not necessarily the solution people believe will happen or trust will happen. However, there is an appetite for lowering migration. In 2015, only 21% of people felt that lower migration would damage growth. But with Labour 17 seats short of a majority, a second election loomed. By October, Wilson wanted to turn his minority into a working majority. Harold Wilson, now Prime Minister for the third time, successfully took action to end the miners' strike that had helped to bring Heath's government down. Shirley Williams reminded the voters that Labour was divided on Europe when she announced she would quit politics if Britain were to withdraw from the European Economic Community. So Labour had 42 seats more than the Tories and would be able to govern comfortably, at least for the moment. Labour would go on to be in power for 11 years with a 4-year break of the Conservatives with Edward Heath in between. Harold Wilson himself was Labour leader for 13 years. A constant face and a comparable today would be Michael Gove, who had some brief periods away, but has been a cabinet member since 2010. Although Labour lasted a little bit longer under the same regime and the Tories changed faces much more, we're coming to the end of the same time period with the Tories of 2024. Does that mean we're automatically going to get a government change? Well, it depends if people trust the alternative. So Edward Heath resigns as Tory leader, making Margaret Thatcher the leader. In 1975, the government renegotiated the UK's terms of entry into the European Economic Community and had this endorsed in the 1975 referendum, making Britain full members of the European Economic Community. 1976, by 76, Harold Wilson resigned. By 77, as the UK economy suffered and inflation was high, the trade unions were demanding pay rises for public sector workers, which the Prime Minister was in opposition to in order to control inflation. This led to strikes causing disruption to many services during the winter. This continued into 1978. So Labour Prime Minister Jim Callaghan was forced to go to the country after his government lost a vote of confidence. Callaghan's parliamentary position became increasingly precarious. By April 1976, the government had lost its formal majority. The immediate reasons were a by-election defeat, the defection of two of Callaghan's backbenchers to form a new Scottish Labour Party, and the defection of the maverick John Stonehouse. He agreed to a parliamentary arrangement with David Seal and the Liberal Party, which became known as the Lib-Lab Pact. When the devolution referenda were held, Wales voted no, and while Scotland voted yes, the majority was insufficient to make the decision binding. So on the same day, the 1st of March 1979, the government lost 2 by-election seats to the Conservatives. The SNP now withdrew its support from the government, and a vote of no confidence on an SNP motion of devolution was passed on the 28th of March. Of course, Thatcher tried to pin the blame for the winter of discontent on the government's shoulders. The Conservatives won 339 seats compared to Labour's 269 seats. 1979 is very analogous to 2024. Economic misery, a government in turmoil, loss of by-elections, the formation of a new party which rivals target seats or target voters. In their time, it was the SNP. In our time, The target voters rivalling the Conservatives are Reform UK. This might be evidence, therefore, of a Labour victory in 2024. However, Labour also have their rivals in Scotland, in the SNP. In the South, they have the Liberal Democrats. So if people don't have enough appetite for Labour, they will vote for those other parties, and they might not win enough seats to form a government. So by 1981, racial tensions sparked riots in Brixton and other areas, and by 1982, Argentina tried to invade the Falkland Isles, which was still a British colony, so Britain started a war over ownership of the islands, and then eventually won that war. This increased Margaret Thatcher's popularity. Add to that the fact that members of the Labour Party were defecting to the Social Democratic Party, and the 1983 elections were already on course for a Thatcher victory. The government was returned with a landslide majority of 144. Argentina was seen as starting the war, and the UK was seen as finishing it, helping bolster Margaret Thatcher. According to YouGov polling, 27% of the public think the blame for the Israel-Palestine conflict lies with the Israelis, and 19% believe it lies with the Palestinians. 87% of the public blame Russia for the Russia-Ukraine war. So clearly, siding against Russia will win voters, but it's harder to choose which public opinion to support with the Israel-Palestine conflict to win an election. I don't expect politicians to be too vocal if they don't have to be. However, in an election, you have to be forthright with the voters. For example, Angela Rayner this week was in a room of Muslim voters explaining her support for Palestine. Now, that will win votes among that demographic, but it will lose votes among the country, as 19% of people blame the Palestinians. By 1984, the 12-month miners' strike crisis over pit closures begins. By 1986, major national industries are privatised. And by 1987, the Labour Party was in better shape than in 1983. Neil Kinnock had replaced Michael Foot as leader and halted the party's leftward drift, moving it back towards the centre. Labour, however, was still suffering from the challenge posed to it as Britain's main centre-left party, the Social Democratic Liberal Alliance. So Mrs Thatcher was returned for an historic third term, albeit with a reduced majority of 102 seats, down from 144. Overall, there's a 1.2% swing to Labour. If seats contested between the Lib Dems and Labour or other parties are too close, then it could take away votes from Labour and they won't win the seats needed. In fact, there's an online movement in favour of tactical voting. However, in 2019, just 1/5 of voters voted tactically. 36% of voters who would have ideally voted for the Liberal Democrats voted tactically, 19% of Labour voters, and just 12% of Conservative voters. That tells you that tactical voting didn't help the left-wing parties in 2019, as the Conservatives won a majority. But it also tells you that of the tactical voters are more likely to be left-wing. By 1990, the unpopularity of the poll tax and divisions over Europe were looming over the Conservative Party. In particular, many leading Conservatives wanted Britain to join the European exchange rate mechanism, a move which Thatcher did not favour. European leaders were discussing merging Europe's currencies to form a single currency, a move which Thatcher also did not favour, and in June, Major suggested there should be a hard European currency unit, competing for use against existing national currencies. This idea was not in the end adopted. In October 1990, Major and Foreign Secretary Douglas Hood finally obtained agreement from a reluctant Thatcher that Britain should join the European exchange rate mechanism. But by late 1990, the economy was in the first stages of recession, leading to inevitable concern among Conservative MPs that their party might not win the next election. So, on the 31st of October, Thatcher spoke out firmly in the House of Commons against the vision of European integration, characterising it as the path to a federal Europe, and declared that her response to such a vision would be no, no, no. This led to the resignation of Deputy Prime Minister Sir Geoffrey Howe. He made a speech against the Prime Minister, which led to a Tory leadership contest, and John Major won and became Prime Minister. As 1992 dawned, the recession deepened and the election loomed. Immigration was also an issue, with Home Secretary Kenneth Baker making a controversial speech stating that under Labour, the floodgates would be open for immigrants from developing countries. Some speculated that this was a bid by the Conservatives to shore up its support amongst its white working class supporters. In 2023, immigration was in second place for the most important issues, tied with health. In first place was the economy. Net migration in 2023 was 685,000. The government believes this is down to care, healthcare workers and students. Also, the government allowed citizens of Hong Kong and Ukraine into the country. Reducing any of these risks the UK's foreign influence, education and healthcare systems. While people see immigration as an important issue, YouGov polling on student migration is mixed, with 20% wanting more, 33% saying it's the right amount, and 19% wanting less. The difficulty is finding who not to let into the country without facing a backlash of some kind. And it explains why our net migration is so high. This was the first general election for the newly formed Liberal Democrats, but the Tories still had a slim majority. Although the SNP increased its total vote by 50% compared to 1987, they only held on to 3 seats they had won at the previous election. It was Labour's second general election defeat under leader Neil Kinnock and deputy leader Royal Hattersley. Both resigned soon after the election and were succeeded by John Smith and Margaret Beckett respectively. By 1994, the first woman priest ordained to the Church of England. John Smith dies suddenly of a heart attack, and Blair defeats John Prescott and Margaret Beckett in the subsequent leadership election and becomes leader of the opposition. So, John Major managed to get the UK out of the recession within a year, but an event called Black Wednesday occurred when the British government was forced to withdraw the pound sterling from the European exchange rate mechanism after a failed attempt to keep the pound above the lower currency exchange limit mandated by the ERM. So in other words, the Eurozone had gotten together and averaged out their currencies and created the ERM so that it didn't cost more to exchange an unvaluable currency into a valuable one. The pound was so unvaluable that it fluctuated out of the 6% rule and therefore had to withdraw from the mechanism because it couldn't keep up. In Labour, Blair had brought the party closer to the political centre and abolished the party's Clause 4 in their constitution, which had committed them to mass nationalisation of industry. Furthermore, about 200 candidates broke with official Conservative Party policy to oppose British membership of the single European currency. The Labour Party won its largest Labour majority of 179, with the Lib Dems also doing well, gaining 28 seats. By changing the wording of Clause 4 to not commit Labour to nationalisation anymore, Labour had moved the party to the centre of politics. But does that make the Conservatives and Labour more similar? Well, 47% of the public in 2024 see the parties as different, and 40% say they're similar. 2019 Labour voters are more likely than 2019 Conservative voters to see the difference. That's interesting because you'd think that the Corbyn supporting left would lean towards seeing the current Labour Party as right-wing. However, as they lost in 2019, it might be because the Labour Party base knows their policies better than the Conservative base in 2019, which was larger. It tells us that the party differences are a little bit greater than expected, but still within 7%, which shows party reputation on issues is more important. So, in 1998, the Good Friday Agreement establishes a devolved Northern Irish Assembly. By 1999, Britain decides not to join the European single currency, or Euro, and in 2000, the dot-com bubble bursts and markets tumble. So, in 2001, 3 things happened: the foot and mouth disease, 9/11, and an election. So people were protesting over the price of fuel, but Labour had resolved that dispute. As Labour remained at the political centre, the Tories moved to the right. The result was effectively a repeat of the 1997 election. How left-wing and right-wing are parties today? Well, according to YouGov, 26% see Labour as slightly left of centre, 22% said fairly left-wing, and 11% said central. Of the Conservatives, 28% say fairly right-wing, 20% say very right-wing, and 50% say slightly right of centre. If you compare the 20% saying Conservatives are very right-wing to the 11% who say Labour are very left-wing, and assume only central politics has the advantage in an election, then Labour are 9 points ahead. Based solely on the party alignment, and assuming central parties win more elections, then that won't be enough to create a Labour majority. So, in 2003, Britain joins the US invasion of Iraq. In 2004, 10 new states joined the European Union. By 2005, by this election, the parties were beginning to capitalise on the lack of plurality in the options people had to vote for. For example, the pro-independent Scottish National Party and Plaid Cymru stood candidates in every constituency in Scotland and Wales. Parties that were not represented in Westminster but had seats in the devolved Assembly or the European Parliament started to take part, including the UK Independence Party and the Green parties. Labour could point towards a strong economy with greater investment in public services such as education and health. This was overshadowed, however, by the issue of the controversial 2003 invasion of Iraq. The Conservatives gained 33 seats, but Labour still retained a majority, reduced from 167 to 66 seats. The invasion of Iraq was one of the factors that kept the Labour government out of office from 2010 onwards. But is it still in the voters' mind? An article from 2023 showed 47% of Britons believe we were wrong to invade Iraq, and 42% believe Tony Blair misled the public on weapons of mass destruction. 21% of people believe he knowingly misled the public and should be tried for war crimes. That compares to 23% in 2010, so it didn't actually go down much. However, the saving grace for Keir Starmer is that just 20% of the public feel Keir Starmer is like Tony Blair, while 34% feel he's not like Tony Blair. By 2007, as a compound result of the Blair-Brown Pact, Iraq War and low approval ratings, pressure built up within the Labour Party for Blair to resign, so Blair stepped down in 2007 and was replaced by Gordon Brown. So between 2007 and 2008, the global financial crisis caused worldwide recessions. In 2009, it emerged that Parliament was using taxpayers' money in unnecessary ways for personal use, known as the expenses scandal. Add to that the recovery from the ongoing financial crisis, and there was deep anger in the electorate by this point. And the Liberal Democrats, looking strong, said do not waste this moment, this opportunity of a general election to transform anger over expenses into lasting political reform. The Labour Party fell down, though, by calling Gillian Duffy's concern about Eastern European migration a bigot. So the Tories gained 97 seats, but Labour only lost 94, leading to a hung parliament, where the Conservatives on 306 seats and the Liberal Democrats on 57 seats had to form a coalition. On the economy, the public are divided. The parties lie neck and neck. 30% say neither party is better at managing the economy, 26% say Labour, and 20% say the Conservatives. Conservative attack lines of previously drummed up fears of Labour in power, the 79 government, the 2008 government, and their record on the economy. However, polling shows it's not a vote winner for them anymore. In 2014, a commitment to hold an independence referendum in 2010 was part of the SNP's election manifesto when it contested 2007 and 2011 Scottish parliamentary elections as part of devolution. The SNP won an overall majority in the Scottish Parliament, so a referendum bill was created. So by 2014, David Cameron held a referendum on Scottish independence, and the Scottish people voted no to independence. By 2015, the Fixed Terms Parliaments Act led to the 2015 election. By this point, the 2 or 3 party system was breaking down with the rise of UKIP, the SNP, and the Greens. The Conservative Party manifesto committed to a straight-in-out referendum on our membership of the European Union by the end of 2017. Commentators talked of the two main parties politically cross-dressing each other to campaign on other traditional territory. So the Conservatives gained a small majority with 330 seats. Notably, the SNP gained 50 seats and UKIP also gained a seat. If we look at the third parties and compare them, Reform are on 11%, that compares to UKIP, who achieved 12.6% in 2015. The Liberal Democrats are on 9% in 2024, and that compares to 7.9% in 2015. And the Greens are on 6% on the 27th of May 2024, and achieved 3.9% in 2015. So the third parties are comparable to 2015, if not slightly better in the case of the Greens. The SNP don't register nationally, but did achieve a whopping 4.7% of the national vote share in 2015, and are on 3% today. So we can expect other parties to make headrooms in Scotland. However, voting for the parties other than the SNP is higher. This might not mean seat wins, however, as in 2015 they won just 10% of the overall seats contested, but it might be the difference between Labour winning and not winning a seat. Now, I've compared 2015 as opposed to 2017 and 2019 because 2015 was the last election that we had that wasn't dominated by Brexit. Yes, we had the promise of a Brexit referendum from the Conservatives, and we had UKIP with a massive vote share, but it wasn't an election that was trying to get Brexit done. So, by 2016, as we all know, David Cameron held a referendum on the UK's membership of the European Union. Britain voted to leave. As a result of that loss, David Cameron resigned, making Theresa May the Prime Minister. In 2017, the Conservatives wanted to increase their majority, but Theresa May ran a terrible campaign with slogans like Coalition of Chaos versus Strong and Stable Government. That, amongst not showing up to TV debates and being altogether awkward against the friendly grandpa, Jeremy Corbyn image, made her lose seats. The Conservatives had to go into a confidence and supply arrangement with the DUP. Northern Irish, Welsh and Scottish politics play a huge part in UK elections as a whole. According to UKIP polling, just a quarter of voters wish to remove devolution from Scotland and Wales, with 45% of people voting in favour. And that, of course, led to her having to seek DUP approval for her Brexit deal. She didn't get her Brexit deal through Parliament because of the Irish backstop, so instead she tried to find a cross-party deal with the Labour that included staying in the customs union so that it could pass through Parliament and not be changed with the future government. But Labour knew she would resign soon, so pulled out of the negotiation. She tried to promise indicative votes, one of which included a second referendum, so the Conservative Party was strongly against this, leading to her resignation. Boris Johnson became Prime Minister. He managed to negotiate with the EU to get rid of the backstop so that the entire UK could leave the customs union and single market. He did get the second reading of his deal through, but didn't get the timetable motion through. By the fourth time of asking, with an extension already in place and no deal temporarily avoided, he called an election. So Boris Johnson had negotiated a withdrawal agreement and campaigned with the slogan, "Get Brexit Done." Whereas Labour were promising to renegotiate the withdrawal agreement to claim closer ties with the EU. Labour wanted a green industrial revolution, while the Tories pledged net zero emissions by 2015. Labour had been plagued with anti-Semitism allegations and promised a lot of nationalisation policies, while Boris Johnson famously ducked out of interviews and promised infrastructure such as high-speed rail too. Jeremy Corbyn's Labour fell down mainly because of attitudes to Brexit, which gave Boris Johnson new seats in Labour areas in the north called the Red Wall. Other fears included anti-Semitism and fears of overspending. A whopping 60% of voters feel the government overspends on overseas aid. That could be where saving commitments could be made in this election. 49% of those surveyed believe the Labour Party is stronger without Jeremy Corbyn. And 41% of Britons would be dismayed to see Rishi Sunak re-elected in 2024. And just 20% would be dismayed at Keir Starmer. 2020. So the UK officially leaves the EU, but then a pandemic called COVID-19 spreads around the world, originating in China. When it hit the UK, the government decided to go into lockdown, making it illegal to mix with other households. Shops, theatres, cinemas and restaurants all had to shut, and only essential work was allowed to continue. The Chancellor subsidised the lack of work with a furlough scheme which paid non-working people 80% of their wage. UK growth stalled, debt rose and inflation rose, caused by supply chain issues. 2021. The UK was still partially in lockdowns, with tier systems undermining the government's levelling up agenda. 232,112 people have died of the disease, with blame laid on the government for not locking down soon enough and for releasing infected care home patients into the NHS. The focus was then on recovery, with getting NHS waiting lists down and a commitment to reducing national debt. By 2022, it was revealed that while it was illegal for households to mix, Number 10 and Number 11 Downing Street were hosting large parties and gatherings which involved wine and cake. Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak were fined by the police for it. Chris Pincher, an MP employed by Boris Johnson, was found to be a sexual harasser. Johnson said he'd forgot about the allegations at the time. This led to cabinet resignations, including Rishi Sunak, and a leadership contest was held. Liz Truss won that leadership contest, but her budget with Kwasi Kwarteng promised a low-tax economy, which when announced, dramatically decreased the value of the pound and caused inflation to skyrocket. This led to her resigning as Prime Minister after just 49 days. Rishi Sunak, who was second in the contest, then took over as Prime Minister uncontested. By 2023, the COVID inquiry exposed the embarrassing conversations that happened over WhatsApp and the expensive PPE contracts that were made that didn't meet the standards required. Just Stop Oil were protesting on the streets, and Nicola Sturgeon of the SNP resigned before being arrested over party fraud. And by 2024, Hamza Youssef of the SNP dropped his net zero commitment, which led to the Green SNP coalition collapsing. With a confidence vote on the table, he decided to resign. The Conservatives continued poor polling, and a number of policies are due to become law after the election if they're elected again. So what can we conclude from all of this? Well, you have to remember that the last 4 years have been in the public's mind the most. So trust in the government is very low because the government said that if we lock down, stay at home, we can save lives. Well, 227,100,000 people died from COVID. The economy was tanked. We had a very short Prime Minister who increased inflation even more and decreased the value of the pound. We had a huge scandal in the fact that the government weren't even taking their own measures seriously within the government. And it's no wonder that the people of today don't trust a word that the current government say. Now, that's all obvious. Like, many people have all said that therefore is going to mean a massive Labour victory because, inflation's high. They haven't done anything in 14 years. Promises have been broken, like HS2. It's all fairly out there. It's all pretty much what everyone's saying and obvious. But just to be the devil's advocate, let's have a look at things that could happen, which could lead to less of a Labour majority or Labour minority or a hung parliament or maybe a Tory minority if they're lucky. They are things like the third party's doing better because people don't trust Labour either. And maybe they won't win enough seats as they did in 2017 when their vote share increased, but their vote share only increased in the seats that they already had. The Conservatives could have a very strong agreement with the Americans to be able to stop the Ukraine war and annihilate Russia somehow. If they do that, or if they have a very clear plan for that, that polling shows that the public have a very strong support for that. Peaceful, obviously. At least having a plan and highlighting the disparity that Labour has on the Israel-Palestine conflict. Rishi Sunak is a more credible politician than Liz Truss, although his favourability is just as bad as Liz Truss was. Proving Labour's record in government might help, at least make people favour other parties. And then if the third parties really drum up, the Green agenda or the migration issue and the fact that neither party is really dealing with migration well enough, and net migration is massive at the moment. But I think the problem overall is that when Rishi Sunak announced the election, the music "Things Will Only Get Better" was playing in the background, and I think the public can very obviously see that things will not get better. If this history shows anything, it shows that when inflation goes high, when debt goes high, it takes years and years to get that inflation back down again and debt back down again and to change government. The Labour government of the 70s were there for ages. The Tories of the 80s, again, were there for ages. And the partisanship politics that they introduced automatically changes and in some places damages the country. So, for example, closing the mines in the north damages those mining constituencies. I think it's very obvious that people think that things won't get better, and therefore that might mean that Labour don't do as well as they expect to do. But I still think that they're going to win the most seats, and I still think the Conservatives will lose this election. But do you agree with me? It's been great to do this again, guys. Join in the debate below and subscribe.